The Supreme Court chamber was cloaked in stillness, the kind that settles only when power collides with intellect. Representative Jasmine Crockett stood poised at the podium, her focus razor-sharp, while Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his expression unreadable. For the 8th time, his resonant baritone interrupted her mid-sentence, the sound reverberating against the marble walls. For nearly half an hour, their exchange had become a measured duel of constitutional logic and restraint. Crockett, undeterred, had tried to maintain her rhythm, but Thomas's interruptions were growing sharper, each question more pointed than the last. "Congresswoman," Thomas intoned, his voice commanding the entire room, "you have yet to articulate a single constitutional limitation on congressional authority under your interpretation of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment." He fixed her with a piercing look. If Congress alone can decide what qualifies as equal protection, what stops it from redefining constitutional safeguards entirely, based on whichever political majority happens to be in power? Before Crockett could respond, Thomas leaned in again, his tone taking on a rare, almost forceful energy. "Without explicit limits, we risk transforming this court into little more than a rubber stamp for legislative will. Precisely what the framers of the Constitution sought to avoid." A ripple of unease swept the gallery. Law clerks froze mid-note. The dense air of the courtroom seemed to constrict as Thomas's final words settled. Crockett paused. Her hand rested lightly on the podium, her face composed, her silence deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady as steel. "Justice Thomas," she began evenly, "the limitation you're asking for already exists, and it's not theoretical. This court established it in City of Bourne v. Flores. There, you required that Section 5 enforcement measures must demonstrate congruence and proportionality to the constitutional injury being addressed." She lifted a document from her binder, her delivery gaining quiet force. "I've referenced that standard 3 separate times this morning, but allow me to be even more precise. The legislation under review fully satisfies Bourne. It responds directly to documented violations, 850 pages of testimony, data, and verified evidence showing consistent state-level practices that undermine the equal protection guarantees this court reaffirmed in Shelby County." She met his gaze squarely. "The limitation you seek isn't absent, Justice Thomas. It's embedded in this court's own jurisprudence." The chamber went utterly silent. Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat, glancing at Thomas, whose face registered a flicker of surprise, a rare crack in his judicial composure. Justice Kagan arched an eyebrow. Justice Kavanaugh began riffling hurriedly through his notes, before diving deeper into this extraordinary constitutional clash between one of the court's most enduring conservative voices and a sharply prepared legislator. Make sure to drop a comment with where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth legal analysis of historic moments like this. Representative Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to high-pressure constitutional argument. Her ascent in Congress had been built not on theatrics or political soundbites, but on a solid foundation of legal precision and unshakable preparation. Before entering public service, she had spent over a decade as a constitutional litigator, arguing before federal appellate courts and handling complex cases involving the balance of state and federal power. Colleagues often remarked that Crockett approached legislation like a trial brief, meticulously outlined, grounded in precedent, and fortified with facts. Her rare appearance before the Supreme Court was not a publicity stunt. It was the logical extension of her deep conviction that Congress itself must defend the constitutional legitimacy of its laws. Constitutional interpretation isn't about partisan ideology, she had said early in her career. It's about ensuring the consistent, principled application of law across changing eras. The Constitution isn't static, it's enduring. There's a difference. At 42, Crockett brought courtroom discipline to every facet of her congressional role. While others rehearsed their talking points for television clips, she spent her nights combing through precedents and annotations. Her legal mind operated with the precision of a seasoned appellate advocate, not a politician seeking applause. Across the bench sat Justice Clarence Thomas, the court's longest-serving member and one of its most uncompromising intellectual forces. Appointed in 1991 after a turbulent confirmation, he had since become a towering figure in modern originalism. The belief that constitutional interpretation must remain bound to the document's public meaning at the time of its ratification. For years, Thomas had been a nearly silent presence during oral arguments, but in recent terms, he had emerged as an active and often dominant voice, his questions sharp and his tone unyielding. The Constitution means what it meant when it was adopted, he had written recently. Our duty is to apply its text faithfully, not to reshape it to accommodate modern sentiment. To Thomas, Congress's authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment was not boundless. It was a tool narrowly tailored to enforce the judiciary's interpretation of equal protection, not to redefine it. His skepticism of federal overreach was legendary, and his jurisprudence reflected a profound distrust of legislative encroachment on constitutional interpretation. That skepticism was now squarely aimed at Crockett. The case at hand, Alabama v. United States, was more than a legal contest. It was a national reckoning over the scope of congressional power to enforce equal protection. The Voting Rights Advancement Act, drafted in response to ongoing suppression concerns, sought to re-establish federal oversight of state election laws. Its supporters argued that it corrected the deficiencies identified in Shelby County. Its critics, including many on the bench, warned it resurrected old constitutional tensions under new branding. As the Act's principal author, Crockett had chosen to do something almost unprecedented: argue the case herself before the Supreme Court, rather than leaving it to the Solicitor General. Her decision electrified Washington and the legal community alike. When Chief Justice Roberts called the court to order at precisely 10 a.m., every seat was filled. Reporters leaned forward. Law clerks lined the back wall, poised with tablets and pens. "We'll hear argument this morning," Roberts said, "in case number 23-741 Alabama v. United States, concerning the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Advancement Act." Crockett stepped to the lectern, exuding calm authority. "Mr. Chief Justice," she began, "and may it please the court. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment empowers Congress to enforce the equal protection guarantees of the Constitution through appropriate legislation. The Voting Rights Advancement Act is a constitutional exercise of that power, fully consistent with this court's precedent governing the balance between congressional enforcement and judicial review." Her cadence was deliberate, confident, and unmistakably grounded in legal mastery. For several minutes, she outlined the legislative foundation of the Act, citing volumes of testimony and data establishing patterns of discrimination. Her language reflected a nuanced command of the congruence and proportionality test first articulated in Bourne v. Flores. Justice Amy Coney Barrett posed the first challenge. "Representative Crockett," she asked, "how does this law differ from the coverage formula struck down in Shelby County? Doesn't it effectively reimpose federal preclearance under a different name?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Justice Barrett," she replied, "the crucial distinction lies in the evidentiary basis. Shelby County invalidated an outdated formula relying on decades-old data. This statute, by contrast, is grounded in verified, recent evidence, documented violations within the last 25 years. The court in Shelby County did not rule preclearance unconstitutional in principle, only that its application must reflect contemporary realities. This act does precisely that." Barrett nodded thoughtfully. The response was surgical, narrowing the issue to legal precision. Justice Kagan followed with a question on proportional remedies. Crockett explained smoothly. Section 4C establishes tiered oversight, assigning the most stringent review to jurisdictions with the most persistent violations. It's a tailored approach, fully aligned with Bourne's proportionality requirement. The courtroom absorbed her answers in rapt attention. Even seasoned court reporters whispered that her arguments had the polish of a seasoned Supreme Court litigator. Then, without warning, Justice Thomas spoke again, his tone suddenly energized. "Representative Crockett," he began, his voice cutting through the stillness, "your interpretation of Section 5 seems to grant Congress extraordinary latitude to define the contours of equal protection itself. Where," he leaned forward, eyes narrowed, "is the limiting principle? What prevents Congress from reshaping constitutional meaning to suit political preference?" The air thickened again. The stage was set for the confrontation that would soon dominate headlines across the nation. This foundational question targeting the core tension between congressional enforcement authority and judicial supremacy. In constitutional interpretation signaled Thomas's central concern. Crockett responded with constitutional precision. "Justice Thomas, the limitation comes from this court's own precedent in Bourne, which established that while Congress has broad enforcement authority under Section 5, that authority isn't unlimited. Legislative remedies must demonstrate congruence and proportionality to the constitutional injuries identified. This standard preserves judicial authority to determine what the 14th Amendment prohibits, while recognizing Congress's special fact-finding capacity to identify where those prohibitions are being violated. Thomas appeared unsatisfied and immediately interrupted before Crockett could elaborate. But who determines whether congressional action satisfies that standard? If Congress itself, then there's effectively no limitation. If the courts then were simply back to the judiciary having final interpretive authority. This first interruption, pressing on the fundamental question of interpretive authority, initiated the pattern that would define their exchange. Crockett attempted to respond with constitutional nuance. The determination involves both branches. Justice Thomas, Congress has primary authority to identify patterns of constitutional violations through its superior fact-finding capacity, while the court retains final authority to assess whether legislation appropriately addresses those identified violations. This creates a constitutional dialogue rather than absolute supremacy of either branch. Thomas interrupted again more forcefully. That formulation still lacks a clear limiting principle. What prevents Congress from using this fact-finding capacity to effectively redefine what equal protection means? Contrary to this court's interpretation, this second interruption before Crockett could fully develop her response, established the increasingly tense dynamic. Rather than showing frustration, Crockett maintained her composed, substantive approach. The limiting principle is that Congress cannot create substantive rights beyond what the 14th Amendment guarantees as interpreted by this court. Congress's Section 5 authority is remedial and preventative, not definitional. In South Carolina v. Katzenbach, this court recognized Congress's special competence to determine what remedies are needed to address identified violations while preserving judicial authority over constitutional meaning. Thomas interrupted a third time, his tone reflecting growing impatience. Kenbach addressed the 15th Amendment, not the 14th. The standards aren't identical, and even if they were, that case predates our more recent Section 5 jurisprudence. The question remains, what prevents Congress from effectively redefining constitutional protections through an expansive interpretation of its enforcement authority? This third interruption, dismissing Crockett's presidential reference, seemed designed to unsettle her command of constitutional doctrine. Instead, she adjusted with precise legal distinction. You're correct about Katzenbach addressing the 15th Amendment. Justice Thomas, the more directly applicable precedent is City of Bourne, which specifically addressed Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. There, this court established that while Congress can remedy or prevent constitutional violations, it cannot alter the substantive meaning of constitutional guarantees. This legislation falls squarely within those remedial boundaries. Before she could elaborate on how the specific provisions satisfied this standard, Thomas interrupted a fourth time, his voice taking on an increasingly skeptical edge. Even accepting the Bourne framework, this legislation appears to effectuate a substantive redefinition of equal protection, rather than merely enforcing this court's interpretation. The coverage formula inevitably reflects a particular understanding of what constitutes discrimination that may differ from this court's jurisprudence. This fourth interruption, suggesting Crockett was misapplying the constitutional standard, led to her most directly responsive answer. Justice Thomas, the legislation doesn't redefine equal protection. It provides remedies for violations as this court has defined them. The coverage formula identifies jurisdictions with documented patterns of exactly the types of violations this court has recognized as equal protection concerns in cases like Cooper vs. Harris and League of United Latin American Citizens v. Perry. Congress isn't creating new rights, but protecting established ones with remedies proportional to the violations identified. Thomas interrupted a fifth time, now visibly frustrated. That explanation still places Congress in the position of determining what constitutes a violation. If Congress can define the scope of violations requiring remedy, it effectively controls the substantive meaning of equal protection guarantees. This fifth interruption, returning to the foundational tension between congressional and judicial authority, prompted Crockett to address the constitutional balance more directly. There's an important distinction between identifying instances of violations and defining what constitutes a violation. The legislation uses this court's established equal protection jurisprudence as the substantive standard, and then applies that standard to specific factual circumstances through Congress's superior fact-finding capacity. This division of constitutional labor preserves judicial supremacy in interpretation, while recognizing congressional expertise in identifying patterns of violations requiring remedy. Thomas interrupted a sixth time, his tone more dismissive. That's a distinction without a difference. By determining what factual circumstances constitute violations, Congress inevitably engages in constitutional interpretation. The question remains, what prevents Congress from effectively redefining equal protection through selective fact-finding? This sixth interruption, dismissing Crockett's constitutional distinction, led to her most technically sophisticated response. Yet, the prevention comes from this court's review under the Bourne standard. If congressional FAST-TF finding is pretextual or disconnected from this court's understanding of equal protection, the resulting legislation would fail the congruence and proportionality test. Here the extensive congressional record over 850 pages documenting specific practices. This court has already recognized as potential equal protection violations provides the factual foundation connecting the legislation to this court's established equal protection jurisprudence. Thomas interrupted a seventh time, his frustration increasingly evident, yet the remedies imposed go well beyond addressing specific documented violations to establish a comprehensive regulatory framework work. This expansive approach suggests precisely the kind of substantive redefinition of constitutional guarantees that exceeds proper Section 5 authority. This seventh interruption, shifting from the constitutional standard to its application, allowed Crockett to demonstrate her detailed knowledge of the legislation's specific provisions. The remedial provisions are carefully calibrated to the nature and extent of documented violations. Justice Thomas, Section 4C establishes 3 distinct tiers of oversight, with the most stringent measures reserved for jurisdictions with the most extensive violation records. This graduated approach ensures the remedy is proportional to the constitutional injuries identified, satisfying Bourne's tailoring requirement. Thomas interrupted an 8th time, consolidating his constitutional objection with unusual animation. "Congresswoman," he said, his deep voice carrying throughout the marble chamber, "you've yet to provide a single presidential limitation on congressional power under your interpretation. If Congress can determine what constitutes equal protection, in this case, what prevents it from redefining constitutional protections entirely according to shifting political majorities?" Before Crockett could respond, Thomas continued with unusual animation. "Without clear constitutional boundaries, we risk transforming the judiciary into a mere rubber stamp for legislative interpretation, precisely what the framers sought to prevent." This 8th interruption, presenting Thomas's most comprehensive challenge to austere congressional authority, set the stage for Crockett's decisive response. The crowded courtroom tensed as Thomas concluded his 8th interruption. Crockett paused briefly, gathering her thoughts as she stood at the podium. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured yet resolute. "Justice Thomas, the limitation you're seeking is explicitly provided in Bourne v. Flores, where this court established that Congressional Section 5 enforcement must demonstrate congruence and proportionality to the constitutional injury being remedied. I've referenced this standard 3 times in my argument, but allow me to be more specific. The legislation under review satisfies Bourne because it directly addresses documented violations established in the extensive congressional record. 850 pages of testimony and evidence showing persistent patterns of state actions that systematically undermine the equal protection guarantees identified by this court in Shelby County. The presidential limitation isn't absent, Justice Thomas. It's already established by this court's own jurisprudence." The chamber fell completely silent. Chief Justice Roberts glanced at Thomas, whose expression reflected rare surprise. Justice Kagan raised her eyebrows slightly, while Justice Kavanaugh began rapidly flipping through his notes. For several seconds, Thomas remained silent, the first pause in their intense constitutional dialogue. When he finally spoke, his tone had noticeably shifted from confrontational to genuinely inquiring. "Representative Crockett, assuming Bourne provides the appropriate standard, how do you reconcile the broad prophylactic measures in Sections 5 and 6 with the requirement that legislation be proportional to the specific violations identified? These provisions appear to reach well beyond documented problems." This question, no longer an interruption, but a substantive constitutional inquiry, represented a significant shift in their exchange. Thomas was now engaging with Crockett's constitutional framework rather than dismissing it. Her response maintained the same precise legal analysis that had characterized her earlier answers. The prophylactic provisions are directly tied to the nature and persistence of documented violations. Justice Thomas, as this court recognized in Hibbs v. Nevada Department of Human Resources, more persistent patterns of constitutional violations justify broader prophylactic measures. The graduated remedial structure ensures proportionality by imposing more extensive oversight only where the record demonstrates more egregious violation patterns. This calibrated approach maintains the constitutionally required connection between remedy and injury while addressing the practical reality that some violations require more comprehensive preventative measures to ensure constitutional injury compliance. This substantive constitutional analysis, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of the court's Section 5 jurisprudence, appeared to genuinely engage Thomas's jurisprudential concerns. His next question reflected a shift from challenging Crockett's basic constitutional framework to exploring its specific application. What specific evidence in the congressional record supports the particular remedial measures in Section 5B? That provision seems especially far-reaching. This question focused on the connection between specific evidence and specific provisions allowed Crockett to demonstrate her detailed command of both the legislative record and the constitutional standard. The congressional record contains over 240 documented instances of precisely the practices. Section 5B addresses practices this court has already recognized as potential equal protection violations in cases like Cooper v. Paris. Pages 317-542 of the record provide specific evidence from 47 different jurisdictions, showing how these practices have been implemented in ways that systematically undermine equal protection guarantees. The remedial provisions directly address these documented patterns, while preserving local authority over election administration, where consistent with constitutional requirements. As their exchange continued, the confrontational dynamic had transformed into something more substantive, a genuine constitutional dialogue between a justice deeply concerned with limiting federal power and a legislator demonstrating sophisticated understanding of the endow's constitutional boundaries of that power. The courtroom observers witnessed something rare in contemporary constitutional discourse, a moment where technical legal expertise transcended typical ideological divisions to create genuine engagement with foundational constitutional principles. As the argument continued, the impact of the exchange between Crockett and Thomas reverberated through the court in subtle but unmistakable ways. Other justices now approached their questioning with noticeably greater technical precision, several directly referencing the Bourne Standard and the specific evidence-remedy connection Crockett had articulated. Justice Allo, typically aligned with Thomas in skepticism toward expansive federal power, reflected this shift in his questioning. Representative Crockett, accepting the Bourne framework you've outlined, could you elaborate on how the tiered remedial structure ensures proportionality between the remedy imposed and the specific violations identified? This connection seems essential to constitutional validity under Section 5. This question, focusing on the specific constitutional standard rather than broader federalism, concerns indicated that Crockett's evidence-based approach had influenced the court's entire inquiry. Her response maintained the same precise legal analysis. Justice Allo, the proportionality is established through three specific mechanisms. First, jurisdictions are assigned to different oversight tiers based on documented violation patterns, with more extensive remedies only applying where the record demonstrates more persistent problems. Second, Section 4D includes a bailout provision allowing jurisdictions to exit oversight by demonstrating sustained compliance. Third, Section 3 establishes a 10-year sunset provision requiring congressional reauthorization based on contemporary evidence. Together, these provisions ensure the remedy remains proportional to current conditions rather than imposing permanent federal oversight. This detailed explanation, focusing on specific statutory provisions that addressed proportionality concerns, demonstrated Crockett's thorough understanding of both the legislation and the constitutional standard. Justice Barrett followed with a question that further explored the evidence-remedy connection. The bailout provision seems significant for proportionality analysis. Could you explain how it differs from the provision this court found inadequate in Northwest Austin? The key distinction, Justice Barrett, is that this bailout provision addresses the specific concerns identified in Northwest Austin. Crockett explained that decision highlighted that the previous bailout criteria were effectively impossible for many jurisdictions to satisfy because they required proving a negative, the absence of any violations for an extended period regardless of their nature or significance. The current provision establishes objective achievable criteria focused on sustained compliance with substantive requirements rather than technical perfection. Specifically, Section 4D2 requires jurisdictions to demonstrate compliance with the core constitutional requirements identified by this court, rather than with every procedural detail of the statute. This response, directly connecting the legislation's specific provisions to the court's prior concerns, further established Crockett's command of the constitutional landscape. As questioning continued, Justice Kagan explored the factual basis for the different treatment of various jurisdictions. Representative Crockett, a key concern in Shelby County was the equal sovereignty principle, the idea that states should be treated equally absent exceptional circumstances. How does the tiered structure satisfy that requirement, given that different states are subject to different levels of federal oversight? This question, addressing a central federalism concern that had featured prominently in the court's recent voting rights jurisprudence, gave Crockett an opportunity to directly connect the legislation structure to constitutional requirements. Justice Kagan, the legislation satisfies equal sovereignty concerns through its evidence-based approach. Unlike the coverage formula invalidated in Shelby County, which relied on decades-old data and imposed identical requirements regardless of current conditions, this legislation bases oversight on contemporary evidence of actual constitutional violations. Jurisdictions aren't subject to different treatment based on history or geography, but based on documented patterns of constitutional violations. This approach respects equal sovereignty by ensuring federal intervention is limited to circumstances where a jurisdiction's own actions have created the constitutional necessity for oversight. Throughout this portion of Circumade, the argument, Justice Thomas remained engaged but noticeably less confrontational than during the earlier exchanges. His subsequent questions focused on specific provisions, rather than challenging the basic constitutional framework Crockett had established. Representative Crockett, Section 3B4, appears to establish a results-based test that might go beyond what the Constitution itself requires under this court's precedents. How do you reconcile this provision with the principle that Section 5 enforcement can't create substantive rights beyond what the 14th Amendment guarantees? This question, exploring a specific tension between statutory details and constitutional doctrine, reflected Thomas's shift from broad constitutional challenges to nuanced engagement with particular provisions. Crockett's response maintained her precise focus on constitutional standards. Justice Thomas Section 3B4 doesn't establish a pure results test disconnected from constitutional requirements. Rather, it implements the constitutional standard this court articulated in Village of Arlington Heights by creating an evidentiary framework for identifying when facially neutral practices may mask unconstitutional intent. The provision specifically incorporates the Arlington Heights factors and requires plaintiffs to demonstrate that the challenged practice both produces discriminatory results and is linked to social and historical conditions that create that discriminatory result. This approach is consistent with this court's recognition that discriminatory intent can sometimes be inferred from a totality of circumstances rather than direct evidence. This technically precise response, directly connecting statutory language to specific constitutional precedent, appeared to genuinely engage Thomas's doctrinal concerns. His follow-up question explored this connection further. But Arlington Heights established a framework for proving discriminatory intent, not a results test. Doesn't this provision effectively transform that intent standard into a prohibited effects test? The provision maintains the constitutional focus on intent. Justice Thomas Crockett explained, it simply recognizes, as this court has, that intent sometimes must be inferred from circumstances rather than direct evidence. Section 3B4C explicitly requires showing that the challenged practice interacts with social and historical conditions in ways that produce the discriminatory result. This interaction requirement distinguishes between constitutional violations and mere disparate impact, ensuring the provision remains tethered to this court's intent jurisprudence, rather than establishing a prohibited effects test. As the argument proceeded toward conclusion, Chief Justice Roberts posed a final question that addressed the core tension between judicial and congressional authority that had defined the Thomas Crockett exchange. Representative Crockett, a fundamental concern with legislation of this nature, is determining who ultimately decides what the Constitution requires. How do you respond to the argument that allowing Congress to establish remedial measures based on its own assessment of constitutional violations effectively transfers interpretive authority from this court to the legislative branch? This question, cutting to the heart of separation of powers concerns, allowed Crockett to articulate her most comprehensive vision of the constitutional relationship between congressional enforcement and judicial interpretation. Chief Justice Roberts, this legislation preserves the essential distinction between defining constitutional guarantees and enforcing them. The substantive standards incorporated throughout the text are derived directly from this court's established equal protection jurisprudence. Congress hasn't attempted to redefine what constitutes a constitutional violation, but has employed its superior fact-finding capacity to identify where violations are occurring and what remedies are necessary to address them. The legislation explicitly incorporates this court's interpretive frameworks from cases like Arlington Heights and Rogers v. Lodge, rather than establishing new constitutional standards. This approach respects judicial supremacy and constitutional interpretation while recognizing Congress's special role in identifying and remedying violations through its unique institutional capacity for comprehensive fact-finding and nationwide remedial action. As Crockett concluded her argument, the courtroom atmosphere reflected recognition of an unusually substantive constitutional exchange. What had begun with Thomas's confrontational interruptions had evolved into a sophisticated dialogue about fundamental questions of constitutional structure, legislative evidence, and the proper relationship between congressional enforcement and judicial interpretation. In his closing remarks, Chief Justice Roberts acknowledged this substantive engagement. "Thank you, Representative Crockett. The Court appreciates your thorough presentation of both the constitutional framework and the specific evidentiary foundation for this legislation. These complex federalism questions require precisely this kind of detailed analysis of both constitutional principles and their practical application." As observers filed out of the courtroom, the unusual nature of what had transpired was evident in their conversations. A veteran Supreme Court correspondent was overheard telling a colleague in 20 years covering the court, "I've never seen Thomas move from that kind of confrontational questioning to genuine engagement based on a lawyer's responses." Her command of both the constitutional doctrine and the factual record was extraordinary. For constitutional scholars watching the proceedings, the exchange represented something significant beyond the specific case. A law professor explained to his students afterward, "What you witnessed wasn't just skilled advocacy, but a rare moment of genuine constitutional dialogue." Representative Crockett didn't just respond to Justice Thomas's concerns. She engaged with debated underlying constitutional principles in a way that transformed confrontation into substantive exchange. That's constitutional discourse at its best. Regardless of how the court ultimately rules, the impact of the exchange between Representative Crockett and Justice Thomas extended far beyond the immediate oral argument. As constitutional scholars, legal commentators, and political observers analyzed the confrontation and its resolution, the significance of what had transpired became increasingly apparent. Legal publications across the ideological spectrum highlighted the substantive depth of the exchange. The Harvard Law Review published an analysis titled "Congressional Authority and Judicial Review: The Thomas Crockett Dialogue as Constitutional Development," noting that beyond the dramatic personal dynamic, the exchange represented a sophisticated exploration of fundamental constitutional questions about Section 5 authority that transcended typical ideological framing. Crockett's methodical integration of factual evidence with constitutional doctrine demonstrated how Section 5 legislation can satisfy even the most exacting judicial scrutiny when properly constructed. Conservative legal stater scholar Jonathan Adler observed, "Whatever one's views on the legislation itself, Crockett's presentation offered a masterclass in how to defend congressional authority within established constitutional boundaries." By anchoring her arguments in the court's own precedents, rather than abstract theories of legislative power, she engaged Justice Thomas's legitimate concerns about constitutional limits, while demonstrating how carefully crafted legislation can satisfy even the most stringent constitutional standards. Progressive constitutional expert Pamela Karlan offered a complementary perspective. What made Crockett's responses so effective wasn't partisan framing, but technical precision. She didn't challenge the born framework that many progressives have criticized. Instead, she demonstrated how robust civil rights legislation can survive within that framework, when supported by appropriate factual findings and carefully tailored remedies. That's a model for effective Section 5 legislation, regardless of the specific rights being protected, for law schools across the country. The exchange quickly became a teaching tool for constitutional law courses. The transcript and audio recording were incorporated into curricula addressing congressional enforcement powers, with professors using the Thomas Crockett dialogue to illustrate both the technical constitutional standards and the importance of factual foundations in Section 5 legislation. This exchange perfectly demonstrates why constitutional advocacy requires both doctrinal precision and factual command, explained a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. Students often focus exclusively on abstract principles without recognizing how constitutional analysis depends on the connection between legal standards and specific evidentiary foundations. The Thomas Crockett dialogue illustrates that relationship better than any hypothetical we could construct. 4 months after oral argument, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Alabama versus United States. In a nuanced ruling that surprised many observers, the court upheld most provisions of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, while invalidating certain aspects of the coverage formula. Writing for the 6-3 majority, Chief Justice Roberts cited the extensive congressional record and carefully calibrated remedial structure as critical to the legislation's constitutional validity under the Bourne Standard. Most remarkably, Justice Thomas authored a separate concurring opinion that explicitly referenced his exchange with Crockett during oral argument. "While I maintain significant concerns about expansive interpretations of congressional enforcement authority," Thomas wrote, "I acknowledge that legislation supported by specific evidence of state body constitutional violations and incorporating appropriately tailored remedies can satisfy Section 5 requirements. The extensive record developed by Congress and the graduated remedial approach incorporated in the central provisions of this legislation demonstrate how Section 5 authority can be exercised consistent with proper constitutional limitations. This acknowledgement, rare for a justice known for his uncompromising constitutional positions, reflected the genuine impact of Crockett's substantive engagement with Thomas's doctrinal concerns. Constitutional scholars immediately recognize the significance of Thomas's concurrence, with one noting, "This represents an evolution in Thomas's Section 5 jurisprudence that may have broader implications for congressional authority in other contexts." The fact that he explicitly connects this evolution to the oral argument exchange demonstrates how substantive constitutional dialogue can actually influence judicial thinking rather than merely rehearsing predetermined positions. For Crockett personally, the aftermath brought increased respect from constitutional scholars and legal practitioners across the ideological spectrum. Rather than using the high-profile exchange to build a partisan brand, she consistently emphasized the substantive constitutional principles involved. In her first major interview following the decision, Crockett focused on the constitutional framework rather than personal vindication. The court's decision affirms an important constitutional principle that Congress has meaningful authority to enforce equal protection guarantees when exercising that authority in ways that respect judicial interpretive supremacy while employing legislative fact-finding capacity. The specific details of this legislation matter less than the constitutional relationship it reflects between congressional enforcement and judicial review. This consistent focus on constitutional substance rather than personal or partisan advantage distinguished Crockett's approach from typical political communication. Even in subsequent committee hearings and floor debates on unrelated legislation, colleagues from both parties demonstrated newfound respect for her constitutional analysis, often seeking her perspective on complex federalism questions that previously might have been addressed through partisan framing. 6 months after the decision, Crockett was invited to deliver the prestigious Justice Robert H. Jackson Lecture at the National Constitution Center, focusing on congressional authority and constitutional development. Section 5 Enforcement in historical context. The invitation, typically extended to established constitutional scholars or senior jurists rather than first-term representatives, reflected recognition of her unusual constitutional expertise and the significance of her Supreme Court exchange with Justice Thomas. In her lecture, Crockett placed the Thomas dialogue in broader constitutional context. The tension between judicial supremacy and congressional enforcement authority isn't new. It has defined our constitutional development since Reconstruction. The challenge isn't resolving this tension once and for all, but developing constitutional mechanisms that allow both branches to fulfill their proper roles in protecting constitutional guarantees. That requires both judicial humility about Congress's superior fact-finding capacity and legislative discipline in respecting judicial interpretive authority. This nuanced analysis, acknowledging legitimate institutional concerns on both sides, demonstrated Crockett's continued emphasis on constitutional principles rather than partisan advantage. Her lecture was later published in the Yale Law Journal. Unusual recognition for a serving legislator rather than a career scholar or judge. Perhaps most significantly, the Thomas Crockett exchange influenced how Congress approached subsequent civil rights legislation. Following the court's decision, legislative drafters adopted what became known informally as the Crockett Model Comprehensive Factual Investigation, explicit connection to established judicial standards, and carefully calibrated remedial provisions that demonstrated congruence and proportionality between the constitutional violations identified and the remedies imposed. 3 years later, when Congress considered comprehensive disability rights legislation, committee staff explicitly incorporated these principles into the legislative process. The resulting Americans with Disabilities Advancement Act included an unprecedented 1,200-page factual record documenting specific patterns of constitutional violations, remedial provisions directly tied to judicial standards, and a graduated enforcement structure proportional to the violations identified. When challenged, this legislation was upheld by an 8.1 Supreme Court decision that cited the Thomas Crockett exchange as establishing the constitutional framework for valid Section 5 enforcement. For constitutional scholars, this legislative evolution represented something significant beyond the specific cases involved. Harvard Law professor Richard Fallon observed, "The Thomas Crockett exchange and its subsequent influence on both judicial and legislative approaches to Section 5 authority demonstrates how constitutional development can occur through institutional dialogue, rather than as backdation adversarial posturing." by engaging seriously with legitimate concerns about constitutional boundaries rather than dismissing them as merely political. Crockett established a model for how Congress can exercise its enforcement authority in ways that respect judicial supremacy while addressing real constitutional violations. The lasting legacy of the confrontation transcended the specific legislation, the personalities involved, or the immediate political context. It demonstrated how substantive constitutional engagement could bridge institutional tensions that often seem irreconcilable in contemporary political discourse. As constitutional scholar Akhil Lamar noted in a retrospective analysis, what began as confrontation evolved into constitutional dialogue precisely because both participants, despite their different institutional roles and jurist-credential perspectives, shared a fundamental commitment to constitutional principles rather than predetermined outcomes. That's how constitutional development is supposed to work in a system of separated powers. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important constitutional developments. Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on congressional enforcement authority and judicial